Hello, and welcome to the Living Legends in Infectious Diseases podcast, brought to you by the International Society of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy, shortened to ISAC. My name is Professor Ian Gould, and I'm a recently retired consultant microbiologist at the University of Aberdeen. Each episode features a conversation with a leader whose work has shaped the field of infectious diseases. And I'm delighted today that we have Jos van der Meer, who, for those who have been in the field of antimicrobial stewardship these past 30 years, needs no introduction. Hello, Jos. Do you want to just say a few words of introduction?
First of all, I'm very honored, let me say that. I don't consider myself as a legend yet because I'm still fully alive and able to correct where things tend to go into fantasy. But anyhow, I think it's a good idea to interview people who have been really inside the field and have had an influence on it. And I think in that respect, I'm fully willing to talk about that. I'm an emeritus professor of internal medicine in Radboud UMC in Nijmegen, where actually I more or less introduced infectious diseases as a major focus of clinical research, clinical practice, and also in education and training programs. That being said, perhaps I should go back to where I came from. I studied medicine at University in Leiden in the Netherlands, and I was trained in internal medicine and infectious diseases in that same place. And I have to mention there that I also did my PhD there. Now, the department in that time was under the leadership of Ralph van Firth, who was one of the pioneers of infectious disease as a subspecialty of internal medicine in the Netherlands. He was not uncontroversial, so to say, because there was kind of a constant tension between the clinical infectious diseases and medical microbiology in those days. But I think nowadays, and say a generation later, those kind of trouble is over. And we can look at good collaborations between the two specialties, and at some places even fusion of the two specialties. Just a little bit about the time. I was, as I said, I did my PhD in Ralph van Firth's department, and he was my mentor there. And that was on totally unrelated to, say, antimicrobial chemotherapy, because it was on macrophage biology, so cell biology, immunology, really lab work. But it was an important training for me to become a, say, clinical researcher.
I think Van Firth was well known more as an immunologist, was he?
He was also into, say, the broad spectrum of infectious diseases from diagnosis until antimicrobial therapy. But his basic research was in immunology on, say, origin, kinetics, and function of mononuclear phagocytes, macrophages. At that time, I became interested in fever as a clinical challenge for so difficult cases with fever, as a challenge for the infectious disease internist. And at that time, I also discovered a new syndrome called hyperimmunoglobulinemia D, or hyper-IgD syndrome, and periodic fever, later called HIDS. And over the past 40 years, we have worked on that syndrome, which turned out to be an autoinflammatory disease, and for which we know the genes, we know the pathophysiology now, and we have good treatments. So that's very, very nice. It also was the reason that I became interested into cytokines, because endogenous pyrogens, as they were called at those days, turned out to be substances like interleukin-1. So I stayed in Boston for one short period and a year. In 1984 and in 1987, with Charles Di Norello, who was considered and still is considered one of the fathers of cytokine biology and especially of interleukin-1. And I still have contact with Charles, and he is really my mentor in that field.
And you got your BTA, as we say, your bean to America. That was important in the early days of my career also.
Yes, and it's a pity that nowadays, with the current political climate, it's not the place to be anymore. That's a complete tragedy, and this should be restored as soon as possible, because otherwise
Hopefully.
we're losing such an important ground of progress in medicine, and also, of course, in infectious diseases and microbiology. Anyhow, that is the current sad situation. Apart from my interest in autoinflammatory diseases and immunodeficiency, and later the concept which we developed in Nijmegen, Mihai Netea and myself, the concept of trained immunity, is my interest in antimicrobial resistance and antibiotic policy, or antibiotic stewardship, as we called it and actually you were one of the fathers of that term, Ian, to get that installed. I think nobody knew what stewardship was until you launched it. Anyhow,
I remember you being slightly against the introduction of a new term, such that the books we co-edited didn't mention that in the title.
They were called antibiotic policies. But anyhow, so when I moved to Nijmegen, I became a professor and became, say, an important player in internal medicine. I felt that I had to develop infectious diseases as a subspecialty and as an expertise in that place. And one of the things that we hadn't done or wasn't done so scientifically in Leiden was the basis of our antibiotic prescribing decisions. Why do we prescribe antibiotics this or that way? And how good is the quality of antimicrobial prescribing? How well do doctors do? What's their behavior when they're alone in their office prescribing drugs? Can we peek into their heads and see what's happening? Those kind of questions started to come, and I was able to get money for this kind of research from the hospital at the university hospital at that time. And I was able to get Inge Gijsens to Nijmegen to start this research really from scratch. And I think in the early days, Inge did beautiful studies, but it was very hard to get those papers published. The Americans were not interested in antibiotic stewardship. Papers were always, if you submitted a paper to ISAC or to Infectious Diseases Society of America, you would always end in the poster session and never have an oral. That was better in Europe, I must say, but it was also in the beginning a hard area to get into and to get appreciation of, especially the infectious diseases community.
I remember some resistance in some of the societies, including not least in ESCMID, to the concept. But through your good offices, we managed to start the European Study Group on antibiotic policies.
Yeah, that was actually an idea which came from the fact that in 95, I think, 96, we founded the SWAP, a foundation in the Netherlands on antimicrobial stewardship, which was paid by the ministry. Actually, we got quite a chunk of money yearly to get that developed. And I have to mention Henry Verbrugge and Rob Janknecht, a medical microbiologist and hospital pharmacist, with whom together we founded this SWAP. And that became the kind of model for SGAP. And I remember quite well that we were sitting, drinking a beer, you, Henry Verbrugge, and I, where we said we should have a European working group to actually try and influence this gradient over Europe in, say, liberal and parsimonious prescribing of antimicrobial drugs, which seem to also actually be connected to, say, religion. So the Catholic countries were much more liberal in their prescribing than the parsimonious Nordic Protestant countries. And now this is, of course, not causality, but it's a nice association.
Just one thing I might argue with you there. You said that when you started out, it was difficult to get anyone in America interested in antimicrobial policies and stewardship. But of course, there was APUA, APUA, formed by
Yeah,
the great Stuart Levy. And I remember Calvin Coonan in
Calvin
Ohio.
Kunin did. Bill Craig was
Yeah.
on that area.
So there were a
There
few.
yeah, but if you were doing this in a more, say, a precise way, you were doing really the daily practice, and you investigated the daily practice and tried to do interventions to change that. There was not a big interest of the, say, the juries in the US. Of course, they all became good friends, especially Stewart did a great job, and it's a great pity that he died a couple of years ago.
Yeah, indeed. What do you consider your best publications on your main research themes, whether it be chronic fatigue syndrome or interleukin disease, associated disease, or antimicrobial
Yeah,
resistance and stewardship?
say scientifically, my best papers are in the field of innate immunity and the autoinflammatory diseases, no doubt. They have the highest impact and so on. But that doesn't say that it wasn't fun to do these antimicrobial stewardship papers and also to ask questions: what is really moving doctors to prescribe as they do, and what are barriers and those kind of things. And we have a paper in the Lancet, which is more a review-like paper on how to prescribe antibiotics and what happens in real life with Richard Hall and Marlies Hulscher, which I think is still a very valid paper that gives directions to the way to go.
You became vice president of the Dutch Academy of Medical Sciences, I believe.
No, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. So
Aha.
the broader thing. I became a vice president, yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and don't be too modest. That was a great distinction for you.
Yes, that was great. And becoming a member is already, of course, a great distinction. And then to be asked to become a vice president was a very nice final part of my professional career in Nijmegen. And afterwards, I was able also to, because of my role in the academy, to become a president of ISAC, of the European Academy's Science Advisory Council. And in that context, we had a whole infectious disease program, which it was actually there are a series of good reports on infectious diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and so on. And I remember that we also had a very nice meeting in Herrenhausen in Hanover, the old palace there, about can we try and get the antibiotic development, the stagnant development of antibiotics, can we change the pace with which that's being done? Can we, as academia, contribute to that? And still, this hasn't had much of an impact because industry is still not greatly interested. Let's face it. And the real new antimicrobial development is still not taken off.
How are we going to solve this important dilemma?
Yeah, we were at this meeting in Herrenhausen. We're actually dreaming about the kind of Manhattan Project where you get the smartest people you can get on the same spot on the earth for, say, a couple of months and see how you, by cross-fertilization, get this field moving again.
Have you seen any evidence that that sort of sincerity exists or that ambition?
Actually, we tried in Herrenhausen to get people from different directions and to get those new ideas, but 2 days is just too short to get to know each other enough and to get enough wild ideas. And you have too little spare time to walk together, to sit together, to drink together, and try and explore new ways of development. But there were a couple of interesting ideas. One of the things, though, and we have published this in Nature Reviews of Drug Development, I think the name of the Nature journal is, in which we show that almost any step in the whole process of development has inbuilt barriers, and there is no swift way to get from an idea to a product. And all the steps, say the basic chemistry, the medicinal chemistry, is more or less dead. Animal experimentation is limited, and often at different places. The toxicology is old-fashioned and doesn't work. And then the first in man studies are very, very difficult. And big pharma is not interested in this first phase. They don't care until you come with a product that has been trialed already.
Do you think AI may help for the future?
Yeah, but still, you have to do the wet work as well. So the wet laboratory is still to be there, of course. But AI can help you, of course, to predict, say, the 3D structures, to help you to tell the pharmacology. It can help you to tell which side chains should be put onto a molecule and things like that. So those kind of things are being facilitated. But I think there should be more European collaboration on such a project. And now with the Americans that start lagging behind, it's a great chance to try and develop that in Europe.
Do you think there's a political will still? It seemed to gather momentum maybe a decade ago, but probably quite naturally it seems to have lost steam.
The tragedy is we had such a big warning by COVID, and the whole world was in a kind of alarm phase and tried to do a lot of things to combat this new kid on the block, this coronavirus. And it should have been an alarm also for antimicrobial resistance. And one of the things, of course, that was a byproduct was that the bacterial infections really went down because of the hygienic measures that were taken. That was, of course, an important message. But on the other hand, also, it could have been a good starting point for thinking about vaccines, using the new vaccine, RNA vaccine technology to say, can't we do these kind of things for bacteria? Starting, for instance, with the gonococcus.
Indeed, Jos, it's been absolutely fascinating. Just perhaps a couple of issues to reflect on. One is your best memories of the golden age of antimicrobial chemotherapy and particularly any major conference highlights. And then we mustn't forget your new career as an artist. So best memories first.
I still have great memories at the time that we were able to organize a yearly conference in the Kurhaus in Scheveningen in the Netherlands. Mark Michel and I and Kees van Boven, the three of us were facilitated in the most generous way by originally by Beecham, SmithKline Beecham, and then GlaxoSmithKline, to have a free hand in inviting people. You were there, I think, also at one of these meetings. And even your father was there, I remember, at one of the meetings.
Yeah, you're really going back in history
It
now.
is, but it was the place where new ideas really came to bloom. And we covered all kinds of important topics in the different years. And there were small booklets made of it that Beecham would use for promotion. But the whole meeting, they stayed really uninvolved and just facilitated.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship with the pharmaceutical industry is often criticized, but in the halcyon days, as well as the excesses, there were, as you say, very useful interactions with the likes of Beecham's, latterly SmithKline Beecham's. These were great, great days indeed.
And they had great scientists on board themselves.
Oh, indeed.
Beecham
Brockham Park.
research in Brockham Park.
That's right.
They were
George
absolute
Rowlandson.
giants in
Yeah.
microbiology and in drug development.
Now, latterly, you've moved in a major way into more artistic endeavors. Do you want to just finish with some optimistic reflections on that?
I have a lot of fun still doing my graphic art. I'm quite productive right now. So I have an Instagram page and a very nice website. And there's a lot of interest in my art, also worldwide. So it's nice.
Excuse my ignorance, but you seem to concentrate rather much on birds or feathered friends.
And fellow friends, yes, because they're fellow friends. No, I think they're so anthropomorphic, and you can actually reflect on human behavior watching birds. I'm not a bird watcher who's going on his belly through the field with a large camera. So I rather sit at home and look at photos which I try to combine, and I take a lot of liberties in that area. But it's fun because they express emotions and they express thoughts, and that's it.
It's been great fun, Joss, and I hope you've enjoyed these rather brief reflections on a fantastic career. And on behalf of ISAC, I want to thank you very much for giving us your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much, and it was great meeting you again.